Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the museum. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of our staff, our trustees, our members, our amazing volunteers. We're really glad to have you with us. This is our latest installment of our Revolutionary Speaker Series, which we began in 2011 in connection with the opening of the Revolution exhibit, and it's done so well we're holding it over, and we may do that for many years, who knows. Tonight's program is made possible through generous funding from Intel Corporation. We're delighted to have Intel be the underwriter of this series for the third consecutive year. Tom Waldrop and Paul Bergevin from Intel are here tonight, and we want to give them a very special welcome. 60 years ago this November, CBS News made a risky and historic decision. It chose to use a new electronic computer to model the outcome of the 1952 presidential election between Republican Dwight Eisenhower and Democrat Adlai Stevenson. It was a breakthrough decision, one not without its perils, but one which also changed forever the nation's understanding of the power of a machine previously used mostly in warfare and science. Election night 1952 introduced a new word into the American lexicon, Univac. When CBS used the Univac to track the Eisenhower-Stevenson election, the computer became famous overnight, and in fact, many people here may remember the mere word Univac became as synonymous with modern computing in the 1950s as the word Google is to modern web searching today. And you can, of course, see the Univac in our Revolution exhibition. Election nights are now the smallest part of how technology drives the modern presidential campaign. We voters are profiled by computers. We're mobilized by tweets. We're hit up for contributions on Facebook. We're mixed and matched in pools of big data. We have a great panel tonight examining the state of the art in presidential campaigns and social media 60 years after Univac. Chris Lehane is a partner in the communications firm of Fabiani and Lehane in San Francisco. Chris was special assistant counsel to President Clinton and legal, communications, and political counsel to President and Mrs. Clinton as First Lady. He was also campaign press secretary for the 2000 Democratic presidential ticket of Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. Sarah Feinberg is Director of Policy Communications at Facebook. Sarah was previously Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Advisor to White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel. She's also served as Communications Director for the House Democratic Caucus. Tucker Bounds was the National Spokesperson and Director of Rapid Response for John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign. In 2010, he served as Deputy Campaign Manager and Director of Communications in Meg Whitman's campaign for Governor of California. He also has served as the Western Press Secretary for the Republican National Committee. He is at Facebook as well, serving as Manager of Corporate Communications. Our moderator is Richard Tedlow, Professor Emeritus of the Harvard Business School. Richard is the author of 7 books on business, marketing, and management, including an award-winning biography of Andy Grove. Richard is also a trustee of the museum, and he is the originator of the idea for tonight's panel. So please join me in welcoming Chris, Sarah, Tucker, and Richard.
I'm an historian by training, so let me just say just one or two quick words. Polling has been around for a long time. If you consider modern statistical technique a technology, the use of the technology of statistics in polling really didn't come on board in U.S. presidential campaigns until 1948, and then they did miss. I mean, Gallup, the polls stopped early because it looked like Dewey was going to defeat Truman easily, and that was the generation of the result of a famous Chicago Tribune headline that says Dewey defeats Truman, and that was wrong. There was a famous poll back in 1936 by the Literary Digest which said that Lyndon was going to defeat Roosevelt. That was wrong too. The reason that was wrong was they took their poll by telephone, and only the Republicans were wealthy enough to have phones in 1936. And so although the sample was huge, everybody was of, and James Farley, who was the Postmaster General at the time, said Lyndon's going to take Maine and Vermont, and that's it. And that was exactly what wound up happening. But then what we just saw here in a lovely clip, I think, is an inflection point in the history of politics in the United States and perhaps the world, I guess, which is the coming of television to politics. It has changed television, broadcasting, and the combination of that with computers, with polling, with scientific methods of sampling has changed the way elections are run in this country and has changed the nature of politics. And so we're very, very fortunate to have as guests people who live this life and know this world as I don't personally. I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand why Twitter is going to like change the world. We had a discussion prior to this meeting, and I was told that, that if I'm lonely between now and Election Day, all I have to do is move to Akron, get a job in a Goodyear factory, and tweet, you know, I'm a white male and I'm a factory worker here in Akron and I just don't know for whom to vote. And if I just did that, I'd have friends until Election Day. Then they would all turn their backs on me, and that would be the end of it. So I'd like to start off by asking what we were just discussing in the green room, actually, which is, here we saw this big inflection point 60 years ago. The world changed with television. Your world, the world in which you live and have to predict the unpredictable and deal with the unfair so many times. And, is the world going to change with the realization that we now have Facebook, we now have Twitter, we now have social media, and if so, how is the world going to change? What's going to be, what is different and what's going to be different? So let's, Chris, let me ask you to start and then we'll just go, okay?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having us, especially with this very august panel, and John, thank you for the introduction. I will say that, you know, Sarah and I worked together on the 2000 Gore campaign, and I think we could have definitely benefited from the Univac in Florida. You know, we were talking about this earlier, right? And I'm probably a little bit of the contrarian here. You know, I do think that we are going to hit an inflection point. I am not sure if we are quite there yet. I think the technology, the vehicles, they do exist for the type of inflection point that you saw in television. And to take a little bit of a step back, right? What happened when television, a little bit predated by radio, but ultimately television, you know, just fundamentally changed the strategic way campaigns are run. It ushered in the so-called modern era of politics. And I use this sort of hub and spoke analogy, but it basically focused everything into a hub where campaigns were able to use electronic media, principally paid media, but also just electronic coverage, to talk in a one-way conversation with the public. Prior to that, you know, campaigns had been much more of a spoke with a little bit of a hub where you actually had to depend on other people out there to be your messengers, particularly in a country the size of the United States, even, you know, 100 years ago. I think what you are seeing happening now is that technology is having an impact where we're going a little bit back to the future. Obviously, sort of on steroids because of the impact, the ability for information to move as quickly as it can, as intensely as it can, and particularly the ability for campaigns to actually have an interactive discourse back and forth with the public, but more so than that, the fact that the public themselves can have a discourse amongst themselves in much more of an active way than we have seen, you know, really over the last 50 or so years. But I'm not sure whether we've necessarily gotten to that transformative moment, right? And as an analogy, and this is a little bit of a flawed one, but nonetheless, I'll endeavor to make it. You know, you saw in the Arab Spring, right? The first time really that the proverbial pen, in this case in the form of a tweet and Facebook and other social media outlets, was more powerful than the AK-47, right? Now that was sort of a market force driving that, right? A real market force, a real political market force driving social change with, you know, with a confluence of technology that allowed that to happen. I'm not sure that's happened in this country yet because I'm not sure we've had that type of an impetus, but I do think that there are the vehicles out there ultimately for a huge impact on small d democracy because of the ability for the public really to engage in a different way than they have historically.
I think that's right. I think Chris makes a very good point that we may not be at transformative in terms of Arab Spring and entire countries shifting, but we are, but what Twitter and Facebook and social media has done is transformed the way campaigns communicate with voters and the way people consume their media. So there was television, there's newspapers, there's radio, and I think there's a whole new world of the way that people consume information, consume media, consume news, and the way that people campaigns in particular, can take advantage of that new platform to communicate directly to voters without having to go onto television or to get a favorable newspaper story written. So it's just it's a totally different medium, and I think it has been transformative in politics.
Tucker?
Well, as our bios pointed out, all three of us are spokespeople, and I think I'm at a disadvantage being the third spokesperson to answer this question.
You just agree with me. Yeah.
I do agree with Sarah. But I think I'd also point out, too, that there are some different dynamics that technology and social media are bringing to the way that the electorate is going to consume this election. And I think that what we're going to see, as we've seen in the past, is that technology tends to build every 4 years. You see a real examination by the public in engaging in new technologies to discover one of the most important decisions that Americans can make. And aside from the way that news will be sculpted, and since the three of us have worked actively with the media, I think that that's something that we're going to talk about more later on the panel, and I'm looking forward to that. But also there's an additional component that I think that we'll begin to see in 2012, and probably even more so in 14 and 16, which is the way that you all communicate to each other and the way that you're using communications to talk to the trusted friends and family that you have. Already, and we're here in the sort of the belly of innovation in Silicon Valley, there's a startup in San Francisco called Fotosin. And essentially what it does is it turns your voter precinct, where you may have been asked in the past to go out and knock in your neighborhood on the doors and talk to your neighbors and friends about who you think you're going to vote for and why they should vote for that person as well. We're seeing that actually happen online. So they're taking a precinct and making it virtual. And so even from the political outreach, in addition to the media and communications outreach, we're seeing technology really begin to have a profound effect on the way that elections and campaigns are waged. And so in that sense, it's a really exciting time, and I think that we're going to see some really cool things in 2012.
What was the name of that? Votosin?
Fotosin, yeah.
All right. I've never heard of it. How do they make their living? Are they hired by various candidates, or are they a nonprofit, or how does this work?
It's a very early stage company, but essentially what they do is they allow you to empower your social network. So people that you may be friends with on Facebook or other social networks, you can reach out to them and transmit your message and your opinions about the election that you're involved in. And instead of going out and walking door to door to meet your neighbors and trusted contacts, you can actually do that from your computer. It's efficient, and it's a trusted form of communication. I think that Fotosin as a company is really hoping that they can leverage that power and help campaigns and elections in the future, and this is really their first election doing that.
So, please.
I mean, it makes sense, right? So if you were a volunteer on the Gore campaign in West Virginia, we would ask you to come to the headquarters and make phone calls or knock doors. That doesn't really make sense now, right? I mean, if someone called me and asked me to come call through a tree of phone numbers, I would think to myself, if I need to contact people, why don't I just contact them on Facebook or send them an email? It just makes more sense. It just is sort of the evolution of voter contact, basically, which is sort of code for the way politicians and campaigns talk to voters. So voter contact has just evolutionized itself to Facebook, to Twitter, it's just gone beyond the phone tree.
Well, that's if I understand it, the Back to the Future observation that you made at the beginning, which is in the old days of retail politics, it was feet on the street, people knocking on doors. And now, first of all, you know the right door to knock on, and secondly, you don't actually have to bother. You can just tweet or something. I mean, is that... pardon me for 1 second. What we just saw was broadcasting, and now you're talking about marketing one-to-one, and that's where we're heading.
No, that's exactly. And look, you saw elements of this, I think, by the Obama campaign in 2008, that in comparison to what the company that Tucker talked about was fairly rudimentary, but for the time was pretty novel, which is you had people in San Francisco or California who were being recruited by the campaign to actually engage with people in swing states. Now that was done more over the phone, but nonetheless, people were being given lists on their email and said, can you call these 10 people, email us back who you've talked to and what their response has been, as part of the get out there. And so you saw the beginnings of that. I think, I'm dealing with this all the time from the campaign perspective. I think one of the elements that's going to evolve, and I think Tucker is right to characterize it almost as an iterative process. I mean, we're sort of in the middle of this as it's happening. Is the challenge of actually being able to take what we used to call voter files, and they're still called voter files, right? And when you typically have a voter file, people create all these analytics with in our business we call flags, right? People are flagged in certain ways, right? Now what you have going on, and both of these two can talk about this probably more comprehensively and with more insight than I can, but obviously people are intersecting a great deal online where you're able to derive an awful lot of information about their habits, what they're doing. Obviously that bumps up into some privacy issues, but ultimately, depending on how all of that evolves, you will be able to mix and mash with voter files and have information that is potentially far deeper and far more knowledgeable than we've ever had, but also the capacity with social media to match that up with the right people to be having the right conversations. Now, we're not quite there yet. And as I said, I think, and you guys can talk about this probably more so than I can, I think there are issues in terms of how you sort of create those profiles and all of that. But those profiles have typically been done off of voter files, right? You now have all this data that people can obviously generate by what people are doing via social media and online. And at some point, you're going to get those worlds sort of coming together. There have been efforts in the past. I don't think they have quite succeeded yet, and there's legal issues for that. But I think that's ultimately some of the stuff that's going to be happening.
Is there going to be too much data?
Well,
And where's the filter, I guess is what I mean, if all these people are tweeting like crazy or putting whatever they're putting on their Facebook page, there's a lot of information that didn't used to be available to people who are campaigning or supporting a ballot initiative, or which is a campaign too, Where is the filter? I mean, do either of you or any of the three of you find a sense of being overwhelmed by data?
Well, if you guys don't mind,
Please.
I think that the filter is every individual online. And that's what I think we'll see bear out over time, is that just like when you scan through your mailbox and you pick and choose as to what you're going to throw away and what you decide to open and consume, in much the same way, each individual online has that power, which was, I think, what is really exciting about what's happening with technology and elections is you have a way to get a lot of different viewpoints and make decisions that are informed by people that you trust, and you can filter it about and make assessments about where the news sources are or the sources of information are that you choose to take with greater weight. And I know that Sarah and Chris and I were talking a little bit about this before, but I think this is speeding ahead some of the ways that campaigns will talk directly to voters right now, and I think we'll continue to see for some time. Arbiters of elections have traditionally been the mass media, and that's something that some campaigns have had major challenges with. Unfortunately, I seem to work on all this. But there is a time that will come, I believe, when campaigns will be able to communicate really efficiently directly with their supporters and encourage their supporters to talk to different supporters.
Okay, so two questions come out of this. One is, do you see the new world of social media as something in addition to the old world of mass media or something instead of? Is that going to displace, in 1952, as we were mentioning just prior to coming on, that was the first time that a political party actively engaged an advertising agency to advertise the president, and that was Ted Bates' agency. The agent was Russell Reeves, and it was Dwight D. Eisenhower. By '56, nobody wanted to be left behind. But that's broadcasting. That's throwing it all out. You don't know who's getting the message. Is what you're describing going to be? Is that going to displace what we saw, or is it going to be additive, something on top of it? What do you think?
I think it's additive. I don't think it'll be instead of. So in other words, look, by the time we get to September, every moment of television will be bought in Ohio and Florida and North Carolina and Indiana and a couple other places. You will not be able to buy television anymore, right? And so
But there'll be a lot of free moments here in California, right?
Not with my initiative campaign.
Oh,
right. I was going to say television stations in California are going to do just fine.
Yes.
Yeah. So no one's taking television off the table. I think newspaper advertising and magazine advertising has gone way down, but and radio maybe a little bit, but no one's taking television off the table, right? People still turn on their television first thing in the morning to get the news, and they sit in front of it at night before they go to bed. I think this is in addition to, and I think, one of the things we were talking about in the green room is, we are in a moment in time where people do not necessarily trust their politicians, and they don't trust the mainstream media either. And we saw that over and over again in the Republican primary debates in the last several months, right? Where people were actually, candidates, Romney was actually going after the mainstream media, or Ron Paul was, or Santorum. And I think...
Newt Gingrich as well.
And Newt Gingrich, right. And so I think voters are now at a point where if they don't necessarily trust politicians and they don't necessarily trust mainstream media, they do trust their friends. And they do trust their neighbors and their colleagues and their friends on Facebook. So it's an additive way to consume news and for campaigns to reach voters. Because if you get that news story from your friend, you're much more likely to read it, right, than you would be just to pick up the New York Times. You may not trust the New York Times anymore, but you trust your friend who's sharing that story with you on Facebook. So I don't think it's instead of, I think it's in addition.
I guess I think we're sort of in the middle, or at some point in the evolution. I mean, you used the TV example, right? But you still go back to 1960. TV played a pretty decisive role, obviously, with the debate with
Yes.
Kennedy and Nixon. But at the end of the day, it was which campaign was more effective at turning out more voters who actually weren't alive, whether it was in Southern Illinois or in Chicago, right? Which ultimately tilted that election. And so there was still the feet on the ground aspect to it in 1960, even though TV had been there. I sort of think we're in that evolutionary phase right now, and what's sort of constantly in my head is the Zagat versus Yelp models, which is, right, for years, as someone who likes to travel to places and have a nice repast, I'd go to my Zagats and look up a nice restaurant to go to, right? That has quickly been replaced by Yelp, which is basically a crowdsourcing social media platform. And Zagat now is trying to catch up to what Yelp created. And obviously, that's in a very defined food area. But in some ways, I do think that that's a little bit of a metaphor for the direction that we are going in. And Sarah touched on something that I think is sort of going to be at the core of this, which is the idea of authenticity and trust. I mean, I think ultimately in any competitive election, it comes down to authenticity and trust, assuming it's a competitive election. And I think that's even more so in online and social media in terms of how people engage and interact. So my guess is we're a little bit in the middle of that evolution. At the end of the day, like I run any number of campaigns, particularly in this state, usually the initiative campaigns. And right now, nothing defeats going out with paid television, right? I mean, we do an awful lot on various social media platforms. They do have an impact, particularly on advocacy and organizing. But when it ultimately comes down to convincing the band of voters who are uncommitted or undecided, and as inelegant and inartful, and the proverbial hammer hitting the mosquito, there's nothing that moves you like paid television. It is what it is right now. Do I think that has the potential to evolve? Yeah.
And if I could just add a little something to Chris, because I think there's an important thing for people to consider on the television point, which is, you mentioned, is there something that's going to tip us to more of an online technology communication stream for voters to campaigns? And a lot of that has to do with demographics. Right now, the reason that Chris will testify to the strength of television is because if you're able to buy time in local evening news, you're going to hit more people that vote. They tend to be an older demographic, and those are traditionally people that are very responsible about their civic duty and are hitting the primary election, the general election, and they break differently, and that there's a science to where these markets exist, and Chris is very experienced in that. But really, with the consumer of information that is the younger generation now, as they continue to get older, I think that you'll see that being the forcing function for more of the investments by campaigns and elections to get into technology and technological advertising, or online advertising, I guess is the way I should say that, than they are in television and your local network news, because that demographic is no longer going to be the leading consumer or the most active voter.
If I understood you correctly, when you were talking about the election of 1960, which this was supposed to be a defining election with regard to media, because it was supposed to prove Marshall McLuhan was right, that the medium was the message. And the reason that that was true was that it is said, correct me if I'm wrong, that more people who saw the debates, the so-called great debates on television, thought that Kennedy had won, and more people who heard them on the radio thought that Nixon had won. And the words were the same, so the medium was the message. If I heard you correctly, also you made reference to the disposition of the state of Illinois in that election.
Yes, the great state of Illinois.
Yeah,
the land of Lincoln.
Yeah, that's what I've been told. It was also the land of Richard J. Daley. And correct me if I'm.
Home of Rahm Emanuel.
Yes, Rahm Emanuel, absolutely. A lot of close friends. Yeah, but my recollection is that Joe Kennedy, I'd like to be corrected if I'm wrong about this, that Joe Kennedy called Richard Daley during the election, or during the night of the election, and said, "Are we going to take Illinois?" And Daley said, "By the grace of God and with the help of some close friends," and those close friends were the graveyard vote, basically.
Yes, I mean, that's allegedly, right? I obviously was not around, cannot personally attest to that, nor would I take an affidavit to any of that. But that is
Chris is a lawyer,
yes,
by the way.
That is the alleged story, but also the reason I invoked that particular moment was that Richard Nixon had a very similar conversation with a very powerful series of leaders in Southern Illinois. And what you really had, to the extent that you believe what has been reported on some of this stuff, and again, I'm not a first-hand witness, I'm not testing any of this.
No, but we've already learned that we're believing the mass media less and less.
That's right. But theoretically, what you had was you had Southern Illinois having a bunch of folks who may not have been alive voting, and you had the Chicago area having a bunch of folks who may not have been alive voting. So the point I was trying to make is that while television played a very decisive role in that election for the reasons that you articulated, at the end of the day, you still had an election that was impacted by some old-style politics that were taking place at both ends of the state, and one side did it a little bit better than the other side.
So what you're saying is that if I don't want to be lonely, I can either move to Ohio and get a job in a factory or die.
Yeah, you'd be very popular. You'd be very popular.
Because, I see, because the graveyard vote is still going to matter.
People will be emailing you and knocking on your door all day.
One of the things that strikes me was this mention of getting a whole bunch of people together in San Francisco and getting them to contact people in states that are in play. Is this something that people talk about? Let me tell you why I'm asking. Because of the Electoral College, which is a relic of the 18th century, Constitution that was written when this was a country of 4 million people hugging the coastline of, the eastern coastline, we have something called the Electoral College. And what the Electoral College does is it effectively disenfranchises me from the presidential election. It doesn't matter. I live in California. I moved from Massachusetts, so it's from the frying pan into the fire. It doesn't matter whether I vote or not. And does that matter? Well, in the election of 2000, either Vice President Gore took Florida or he didn't. I mean, maybe 35,000 Jewish voters in Palm Beach actually did vote for Pat Buchanan. I don't know.
We're pretty sure they didn't.
But there's no question that Gore won on a popular vote basis. But that doesn't matter because that ain't the way it's counted. So if I heard you correctly, and I'd like to be corrected if I'm wrong, is that to a certain extent you're empowering me as somebody whose vote doesn't count because or the new technology, put this way, writ large, is enabling me to influence someone in Ohio or in Colorado or in the 10 states that really do matter, we're told, in this election. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that that's not a necessarily new practice. I think that, as long as we've had elections that have existed out of a single province where counties will call into target counties and, states into target states. So that has been going on. I mean,
my question is, will the new technology make that more scientific? Will it
It'll make it more efficient.
Yeah, more efficient, more targeted. the efficacy of it will improve significantly.
Now, for example, would it find out that, in fact, I have a college classmate who works in Cincinnati. For all I know, he hasn't made up his mind. So if I went to San Francisco, would this company that you talked about in San Francisco, or would Facebook or would Twitter sort of know that and would tell me to get in touch with Tim Quinn?
Well, I think that there will be, and there is, targeted advertising that campaigns will be able to invest in that will be able to identify whether or not voters have certain sentiments on different issues. And so, to your specific question, if your friend in Cincinnati was to have strong views on a certain type of issue, then they could be getting advertising through the campaign directly to them. And it is quite possible that in the future, maybe this election, that there would be a campaign organized enough to know that you should be reaching out to your friends that are weighing in on a specific issue based on direction they're giving you. So yeah, sure, you could get communication from a campaign that says, if you have friends that have weighed in on this issue in this manner, you should reach out to them and tell them the truth. In fact, I think that gets back to where we originally started the conversation around how the media battle will be changed as a result of the online communications and social networks, because starting 2 elections ago, and certainly in 2010 it became much more high profile, but now the way that campaigns are working, remember that John McCain, who's now one of the most prolific tweeters in the world, did not have a Twitter account in 2008 when he ran for president. And so, we've seen already an evolution. In 2012, both candidates will have great Twitter followings, and they'll be weighing in on issues quickly. And so I think that what you'll end up seeing is that rapid response move through social media, so people are seeing content on TV, or they're picking up on a national news media event, and they're able to get direct communications from people they trust, either supporting it or voicing an opposition to it.
Yeah, a couple quick thoughts just picking up on that. One, I do think ultimately you are going to get the segmenting of data, particularly as systems become more interoperable and you can actually shift and move this stuff. So, it's certainly conceivable that, living in San Francisco, I could get a list of 20 people who have some connection to me at some point in my life that someone was able to determine through various databases, and they've been identified as undecided voters in key states, and I get an email saying, can you call these 20 people? You have a relationship with them. We know you support candidate X. Will you please ask them to support candidate X, right? I mean, I think that certainly is going to be something that happens in some form or fashion. I mean, right now you have entities. There's a company out of San Francisco called Politeer, which is founded by one of the founders of Travelocity, that has created this technology where it's basically a dashboard, and you can not only follow everyone who's talking about your particular candidate. They also use this for hotels and other types of businesses that have high consumer interest. Not only can you follow anyone who's talking about you on social media, but it identifies specific individuals that are particularly influential in social media. So they'll say, this particular person is tweeting about you. They have a large following, but more than just a large following, they have a large following that's in a demographic or matches up with issues that you or your campaign should care about. And so that you're able to then, in turn, target your communications and engage in a back and forth conversation with that particular person who's particularly influential because they have a much larger universe of folks who trust them. So I think you're going to get more and more of that type of technology coming into play that becomes tactical tools for the campaigns to more effectively engage in that dialogue. And that back and forth.
The dialogue is the key.
Yes.
We're talking about a dialogue now, not just one-way
back and
communication.
forth.
Yeah.
But Chris brings up a really interesting point. I mean, Politeer, if you look at it, he's talking about being able to be persuasive on social media. And 4 years ago, these candidates weren't, one of the major nominees wasn't using it. So that's how much we've advanced in 4 years. And so it's exciting every time we have one of these elections where people around the world will be focused on this decision and new technologies will spring up. And, it'll be exciting to see things like Politeer that will emerge in 2012 and what we're going to see in 2016.
If television is if this is going to be in addition to rather than instead of, are you telling us that campaigning is going to become more expensive because someone's going to have to pay for this? And if it's going to be in addition to, not instead of, money's going to have to come from somewhere, right?
We see it get more expensive every 2 years, right, or every 4 years. I mean, the predictions are that this year's presidential election will amount to spending at more than $1 billion. I mean, that is is unbelievable. Now, not helped by the Supreme Court, who said that corporations can decide to play in these campaigns as well. So you're going to see enormous amounts of money flow into these races because you've got super PACs who can spend like crazy. But I think we are nowhere near the tipping point where they become less expensive, right? I can't even imagine.
No, I mean, although I'll give a shout out to Facebook, which is, to buy advertising on Facebook is a lot more efficient and cheaper than it is to buy television, right? Now, I think there's different metrics, and people on my side are still trying to figure out, can we actually get to the proverbial swing voters, or are we sort of, I'm shocked that was the answer, but yes. But bottom line is, assuming you can get to your targeted voters and you can get to them in a way that moves them, then it's a much more, because you're hitting your bullseye, right? I mean, we talked earlier about paid television. He uses the mallet, right? 80-90% of the people you're reaching with paid television have made up their mind one way or the other, right? With the targeting that you can do via social media and other online tools, you ultimately can actually really focus in on a real bullseye target so that every dollar is actually communicating to someone that you want to talk to.
Do you think that the Obama campaigns, 4 years ago, not now, but they were obviously out front versus McCain with regard to social media, and I mean, it was famous that the president had a BlackBerry, the now president had a BlackBerry, and hopefully, so how much of a difference do you think that made in that campaign? I mean, do you think, and even, let me ask you, and then I'd like to broaden it out more generally, because I have another question following, but how much of a difference do you think it made that?
Well, I think it made a huge difference. I mean, I think the Obama campaign in 2008 was they were doing the most cutting edge technological voter contact, fundraising online, reaching millions of people that we'd ever seen, right? And to be honest, if they took that blueprint and they did nothing but the exact same thing in 2012, they'd be crazy, right? So they've already gone, and I'm not.
The world has changed that much.
The world has changed that much, right? So yeah, Tucker's exactly right. John McCain wasn't the only person without a Twitter account in 2008. Almost no one had a Twitter account in 2008. It was in its infancy, right? And so they were incredibly cutting edge in 2008. I'm sure that they're doing much different stuff in 2012 to stay way ahead. Do I think it ultimately made the difference between a President Obama and a President McCain? I don't know. I don't think it did. I think that it was a year for Democrats. I think President Obama had a message that spoke to the country. I don't think technology made the difference between him being in the White House or not, but it made massive amounts of difference in terms of fundraising and reaching voters that wouldn't have been reached otherwise.
And can any of you put your finger on an election, and not necessarily for an individual, but for a ballot proposition, for example, where you feel technology actually did make the difference between a win and a loss?
I'll use one example, which is, and technology works many different ways. I mean, we can talk about communicating with people via the social web, or we can talk about email trees, but really there are campaigns are iterating on technologies in a lot of different ways, and in really exciting ways. For example, the Whitman campaign in California developed a system to be able to track real-time Jerry Brown's speech. So when Jerry Brown would have an appearance, there would be someone from the Whitman campaign with an iPhone that was live streaming it back to Whitman campaign headquarters, so that the communications team could be emailing reporters responses to the actual charges that Jerry Brown was making in real time. And it was the first time that they've been able to piece something together like that. And now you're seeing campaigns at the state level doing that type of thing now. Of course, at the national level, you already have a live stream with these television stations. But as to whether or not a campaign actually made the difference, in kind of an unconventional way, Brian Bilbray, who's a congressman in San Diego in 2006, it was a special election. Duke Cunningham had been run out of town for good reason, and that was a hotly contested seat and was seen as a bellwether as to how the 2006 House congressional elections would ultimately fare. Unfortunately, it was not the bellwether that the Republicans had hoped, but we at the RNC were providing a lot of assistance to Brian Bilbray, who was running against a candidate who had been captured on tape, inviting someone who was not a legal voter to participate in the election. And in that particular district in San Diego, this was very controversial. That tape was then moved to YouTube and then put on the talk radio stations in San Diego. And in such a hotly contested race, I think that a lot of people that were participating in that election will look back and say, catching that technology and moving it in the way to the media that it did, it ultimately changed the election. I mean, there's the famous macaca moment again in 2006. So these things, candidates making slip-ups and saying things that they shouldn't have.
Can't escape them now.
You can't escape them now.
Right, the famous closed event in San Francisco where a blogger, happens to get, then Senator Obama talking about Pennsylvania, which instantaneously, by the next morning, is a major national story and still an issue that the president...
This is when he said that what they have are their guns and their religion, or words to that effect?
To that effect, yes. But it's a similar type of a situation where that guy... the one
Could you just tell the audience what the macaca moment is? Because it's possible that some people in this room don't know what it was.
Senator George Allen, who was an incumbent senator in Virginia.
And people thought he was a presidential timber, right?
Early presidential
right?
type of hype building around him. I think that a lot of people considered his race in 2006 more of a technicality. He was popular in the state of Virginia, had been governor of the state of Virginia, and was caught on tape by a phone, making a statement that was a racial slur. And it wasn't tolerated by the electorate, and he was ousted from office. I think that was a turn of events that was made possible by his Democratic opponent because of technology. But there's a lot of technological innovations that are happening on campaigns aside from just online communication, and it's really fascinating to watch.
Chris, I interrupted you.
I was just thinking as you were talking, my first national campaign was in 1992, and I was much younger and much quicker at that time. And one of my first assignments was to go to opposition events, and then you would actually have to sprint with the reporters to the nearest payphone to call back to whatever had transpired, right? I mean, just think of that compared to, right now with nanotechnology, you're going to have nano drones at some point in the next 10 years, right? You're going to have a nano drone over, so, I mean, just think of what, you could have done with Watergate. All the president's men could have used a nano drone and they would never have had to break into the Watergate. I do think, to me, the sort of first defining moment with tech was really the Dean campaign, because I think that's the first time, I distinctly remember being in a campaign discussion for a rival campaign in the first quarter of reporting, and Dean's money just kept rolling in. There was all these online donations, and they kept going up, and everyone kept reporting his number, like over the course of the day, kept getting bigger and bigger by substantial amounts. And I remember we were in a meeting, and someone said, "Oh, there's a ceiling to what you can raise online," and then which then precipitated a discussion about the quote-unquote cascade effect, which suggests that because of technology, the multiplier effect is different than what you typically had in the past. And I always remember that as really sort of, at least for me, sort of a defining moment when you really saw the role of technology. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
No, that's okay. It's interesting just listening to Tucker. I actually worked on the other side of that Brian Bilbray race in 2006 when I was the DCCC. And for as important as technology is, and I believe that, I work at Facebook, it's interesting, the morning after that special election, we all woke up, went to the DCCC, Rom was going crazy. Yeah, really throwing water bottles. And what we took away from that race was not that our candidate had just gotten beaten by saying something really stupid while an iPhone was rolling, but we had not tied the opponent enough to a very unpopular President Bush. And so our takeaway from that was that it had nothing to do with technology, but that we had missed the elephant in the room, which was we should have tied Brian Bilbray directly to George Bush. And so it didn't have a whole lot to do with technology, and I guess my larger point is there are still some really big things that matter, so you can get all the technology right. And if the economy is bad, if the president's unpopular, if the country is against you because they're frustrated with the direction of the country, if the right track, wrong track's in the wrong place, that stuff tends to really matter.
Well, do you think there's going to be a
at the end of the
forest
day.
and trees problem, for example, in this coming election? I mean, that there's going to be so much sort of narrow casting and such specificity that there's going to be some huge, gigantic fact out there that just gets...
Well, I think actually, to Sarah's point, I mean, I'll be the first to admit this, unfortunately, 2008 wasn't a close election, and I think that there are strong reasons why the economy was really ultimately the deciding factor. In fact, I've heard people that I worked with on the McCain campaign say that actually that campaign was decided in the mail, that the most effective mailer that was ever sent was everybody's retirement accounts when they showed up in October. And so, but actually you look at this election, and I think that technology really will make a difference, because I think that this is going to be a much closer election. Depending on if we see sea changes in the global community or in the economy, if things remain the same, looks like a 50-50 race.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but we just heard from Sarah that what you didn't do as effectively as you wish you had in hindsight, perhaps, was tie your opponent to a very unpopular President Bush. Why won't the Democrats do the same thing with the Republican candidate and make it not as... Why does your instinct tell you this is going to be a close election, I guess?
Well, I think the polling data suggests that right now. I think that, potentially...
It's a 50-50 country.
It looks like a 50-50 race, and I think that, it's impossible to tell. I mean, if I could tell you who was going to win this presidential race...
And then let's keep it between the two of
yeah.
us.
Bring back Univac.
Instinctually, I have to believe that it's going to be a closer race than what we experienced in 2008. And when the margins of these races get closer, I think technology becomes increasingly relevant.
Right.
And so investments in that type of communication are going to be really critical in this election. And I think both campaigns realize that.
Can I just ask Sarah and Chris, do you think this is going to be a close election? I mean, barring the unforeseeable, war with Iran or a complete stock market crash, I mean, do you think this is going to be a close election in 2008?
I think it's a 50-50 country. I think the president is in an incredibly good position. I think he's very strong. I think he has an amazing record to run on, a lot of successes. But look, I think you have to approach every election like it's going to be very close, and that's the way we approached 2006, the way we approached 2008. So I think you always approach it that way, and ultimately this is a country that's very closely tied. And so I think, barring something massive, it's going to be a relative. I think we have to expect it to be a relatively close race, but the president's in a very strong position.
I think that's absolutely. First of all, I do think presidential campaigns are different than congressional races and Senate races, and they're very different animals. I do.
Well, and the essence of that difference is?
Well, I'll finish this, which is I do think that these guys are absolutely right. This is going to be an exceptionally close race, I think, for all the reasons articulated. I do think that the point that Sarah made earlier is worth just sort of belaboring, which is I do think that there are macro issues. There's three types of elections, right? There's an election where the incumbent is in such a difficult position that you could run a refrigerator against the incumbent and the refrigerator wins, right? Then there's the election that, I was in 1996, where the incumbent is very strong because of macro issues, strong economy. Bill Clinton, could have run against a combination of Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and he still wins, right? And then you end up with an election like this is going to be where because of the larger macro forces, primarily the economy, you're in very much of a gray area, and it is a 50-50 country, or really, a 47-47 country with 6% of the electorate up for grabs, and as we talked about earlier, about 100 precincts in 5 or 6 states, right? I mean, that's what the election, is ultimately going to come down. And, my view is that, GDP stays between 2 and 3%, and you don't and you continue to have at least the job growth either stays where it is or is generally static. It doesn't go backwards. Then I think, under that formula, the president wins, because the president, I think, has a decisive advantage on the trust issue. If you have GDP that gets below 2%, and hope for everyone it does not, then I think it becomes a very more challenging election. Yeah, and I think anytime you get to that close of a level, right, where you're really slicing the political bologna that closely, then every single tactic, right? People ask, the Gore campaign, there were 5,000 decisions that you could look back in retrospect when it was that close, that if you had made this or that, right, keeps you up at night, right? So I do think that technology and all of this will, if the election becomes that close, it will have that type of an impact. I still think that the essence of Sarah's point is right, which is there are some larger macro issues, which ultimately all of this is through that prism.
We have a whole bunch of questions from the audience, and let me just sort of just read them and see. will Web 2.0 or a successor lead to local and national voting or initiatives on the internet? Which I guess another way of asking that is, do you think we're heading toward digital democracy in any...
This is my favorite. I love this question.
Well, you've got
Yes, do you mind if I take
Go
this
for it,
one?
please. Go for
because
it.
I do think that this is ultimately, at least in this state, potentially that transformative tool, right? I do initiative campaigns. I typically do them more on the progressive side. I am doing the campaign right now to raise the tobacco tax $1. We're going to spend a couple $1 million. Big Tobacco is going to spend between $40 and $60 million against us, right? I mean, it is, we bring our little slingshot to campaign every morning.
Yeah,
but
it's God's work.
Right, it is God's work, yes, through justice and democracy. Right, the initiative process in California was initially put in place by Hiram Johnson to be a bulwark or a hedge against major powerful interests that used to control the State House. It has, over the years, become a tool, in fact, for powerful special interests to use in any number of ways. And at times, progressive groups can cobble together enough money and get something on the ballot. But imagine if you actually gave the public, the ability to do an electronic signature over Twitter or over Facebook, and it did not cost the $2.5 to $3.5 million, which is the price tag to qualify an initiative. Suddenly, the public, at least in this state and other states, the other 30 some odd states that have initiatives, would get sort of the initiative process back to the way it was originally designed. And I also think, and I think this is going to be a battle that's going to continue to become, a bigger and bigger conflict, which is the ability to vote and do other types of direct democracy, online. And I think all of those things are sort of, that's why I said earlier, I think there are tools in place. I'm not sure they have necessarily been used for the transformative way. I think those are ways that it would be enormously transformative. And then the final one, and I'm sorry to talk so long, but earlier in this campaign, there was the Twitter debate. And we talked about this earlier, and I'm sure some of you saw it. This was in South Carolina. And you had Romney and the others. And Twitter basically gave a green and a blue, whether they thought the broader public was responding, that they thought the candidates were being honest or not honest. Romney had a very difficult debate where he was in the red almost for the entire debate, which then set him up for 4 or 5 really tough, challenging weeks, which in many ways have sort of set up his negative storyline that's going to last throughout this campaign. Imagine if you are in a world where candidates are going to basically be able to get constant dial tests on an ongoing basis. And you're giving a speech up there, you could literally have something in front of you that tells you how sort of the crowd is responding or the public is responding. I don't think you're that far from seeing some of that technology used in that type of a way. And to me, you can say that that can manifest itself in a very good way, which is people have to be authentic and trustworthy. On the other hand, people could just become very good at understanding how they want to use that to their advantage. So I think that the tools are out there. I'm going to be very interested in seeing how they ultimately manifest themselves.
So, you can see a world someday where a politician is literally giving a speech, and he says yes, or she says yes, and the screen turns green, and the politician says, by yes, I mean no, and the screen turns red,
and you can even go farther, right? People talk about singularity, right? Ray Kurzweil, right, who you had up there earlier.
Yeah.
Imagine if you have something that, a nano thing somehow implanted in you somewhere, right? And you're automatically able to, have communications and be able to sort of process that in real time. Again, it sounds far-fetched. It sounds like science fiction stuff, but, people are actively talking about a world where there's going to be singularity, and this stuff is going to be sort of integrated into your being.
So technology can liberate my inner Bill Clinton and then help me understand and relate to people.
As long as you bring all the jobs that Bill Clinton did, people will be very happy.
Here's another quote. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say we're kind of getting into a slippery slope there, but I think there is...
I think we've slid down it.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a practical application of technology and the way it manifests itself in future elections that we should probably talk about to do the topic justice, which is something that Chris has talked about before in our previous conversations, which is we're moving toward a place where you'll be able to make more informed decisions because people will be able to communicate and advertise you more personally and in a targeted way. So, it may be that the most important issue to you is fisheries. I bet you that you do not hear anything about fisheries in the presidential election in 2012. Now, there may become a time very soon where, because of the targeting nature of political campaigning and advertising, they'll be able to communicate directly to people that do care about fisheries about what their position is on restoring wildlife and ensuring that cattle aren't destroying upstream fisheries. And so, you know, in many ways, I think there are going to be technological evolutions to the way that we are communicated with via campaigns that'll really help us make better informed decisions, as opposed to necessarily giving rapid response feedback to the candidate, which then they cajole to conform to. I think it'll be more about you're going to know more about the candidates and feel better about the choices you're making.
There's a question that deals directly with this, so let me just read it. Communicating about complex policy issues using conventional media is almost impossible. Have you seen any examples of using new technologies to do a better job of engaging the public in a policy debate that goes beyond simplistic slogans and talking points?
Great question.
Sarah, I think you've got this one.
Well,
That sounds like a question for Tucker.
Right.
actually, I thought it was, because what you were saying, I thought, was that, you know, through using new technology, you can get deeper into what people actually do believe about what matters a lot to you. That's what's being asked here. What do you think?
Maybe one of you guys could talk about the SOPA example. I mean, that was a debate that was pretty.
I'm happy to. Do you want to talk about that?
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I was actually going to say something different, which is that I can see, and this is sort of goes along with what Tucker was saying, I can see a time where campaigns or even incumbents who are in office, who are serving in the Congress, are able to be so targeted and so focused on what individual voters want to know and are most interested in, that you could end up getting policy papers and speeches and constituent letters and sort of everything targeted to you on a very issue-specific basis, which I think is probably, the targeting would probably be the best use of the technology that I could think of to answer that. But what were you going to say about SOPA?
Yeah, I'll give a couple just for examples I think are at least consistent, although maybe not specifically on point. I mean, there's always also the challenge in the representative democracy, exactly how all of that plays itself out. But we did a campaign a couple of years ago where we actually did a challenge, online for folks to come up with the best TV spot, and we just sort of put it out there, and we offered to run the winner, which was going to be based on a crowdsourcing vote on the Jon Stewart program. Shockingly, maybe not that shockingly, the ad that ultimately was the winner was actually better than any ad that the campaign itself was producing. It was a really good spot. We ended up actually running it more than just on the Stewart program. But we really engaged a very broad audience. Actually, as we were going through the process, I had an entity that actually called and tried to buy our site from us because they looked at the analytics. Right? They had no idea it was really a campaign or anything. They just saw the analytics, and it was a great demographic. This also, and Tucker, I'm sorry to bring this up, but during the MEG campaign, I ran an IE, and we actually, and this was probably the exact opposite example from what the person questioned, but there is some relevancy here. We created something called Megpedia, which was a crowdsourcing site for opposition research. And so we had folks who had worked at eBay and at other places, who poured stuff in over the transom. A number of items which reporters later took, did some investigative reporting, and tested out and proved out. And so that was sort of an interesting way to use crowdsourcing in an opposition research way. Now that may not necessarily be the most constructive way to use it for the good of democracy, but it was a really interesting tool to apply. And I do think that you're going to probably see some elected officials begin to use those types of crowdsourcing tools as they develop policy. I mean, the president, I think, has done it to some extent, actually, with some of the electronic town halls that he has done in the conversations that he has had. There actually was some kind of an effort at the White House to really sort of involve the public in some of the public. But I think that you will see someone who runs for office who decides to basically have an open source campaign. He will ask his followers to create the ads. He will, ask his followers to collectively, in some type of crowdsourcing way, come up with the policy positions based on some of his principles and beliefs. And then ultimately, maybe that person gets in office, and then that's reflected in terms of how they approach their government. I do think you'll see that. There will be some kind of an open source campaign.
I have another one for you. Will what you're discussing, or what's being discussed up here right now, make campaigning bi-directional, where candidates react to messages from voters as much as they push messages to voters?
This I was mentioning SOPA before because I think it's relevant and it's timely. Recently there was some debate about access to the internet. And this was a huge news story, as I'm sure that you've all seen in the last month or so. And I think that was an example where these, I guess it's probably dated to call them net roots, but at least that was what they were originally called, came out of the woodwork, and people were communicating to Congress in really energetic and active ways to each of the individual members of Congress. And it was an overwhelming success for the technology community. And I think that it goes back to an earlier point that Sarah made, which was like, we can talk about campaigns and elections, and that's great because there's so much information that's being pushed out to so many different people. But probably the most exciting things that are happening are what people that are actually governing are doing with technology and getting feedback on specific policy debates that are going on so they can get a better idea in real time about what positions they should take into account. I don't think I'm forsaking any confidences that there were some individuals that came and visited us that work actively with the Congress to explain that they'd actually been able to determine that the traditional writing your congressman a letter and your congressman writing you a letter back has decreased dramatically as a result of Facebook's product, because members of Congress are on Facebook and they're actively every day talking about the business that they're taking up in Congress, and they're getting feedback from constituents in large amounts, and they're able to communicate in a much fast and timely manner so that they're not getting a letter about a bill that they voted on 3 weeks ago and then sending a letter back, and by the time that somebody else gets it to consider, it's in with the Christmas cards and totally ignored. So we're getting into a place where people can understand their government better, and that's probably the back and forth conversation that people are benefiting from most.
What do you think? I mean, do you think that this is going to, is this movement or set of technologies that are now available, and it seems like they're springing up all over the country and at a rate that those of us who are not really in the business are really unaware of, is this going to make government at the end of the day more responsive because people are going to find out more quickly about what they really care about?
I think it will. I think to the extent that a voter or a constituent, even a citizen, is interested in what's going on in Washington, in the Congress, with someone who's running for office, to the extent that they're engaged and are paying attention and want to be involved, they will receive a dialogue back. So it's almost everyone has a voice with the person who's running or with the incumbent, and they get a dialogue back from that person. I mean, one of the great things about Facebook, but also about Twitter, is that members of Congress become real people, right? They engage with constituents on both platforms. They don't typically only talk about the vote that I just took on SOPA or the vote that I just took on healthcare. They also say, looking forward to being in Menlo Park this weekend for, my family barbecue, or looking forward to taking my daughter to college next week. I mean, they become sort of real people, and they can interact with people interact with voters on a more normal basis and in a dialogue. And I think it'll be more responsive, and it's also more human.
Is that dangerous? Because when you become a real person, then you put a lot of things in play that none of us have perfect pasts, that maybe would best be sort of left out of the public sphere.
I think, look, as long as you take the Anthony Weiner pledge, right? I mean, right? Use common sense in terms of how you're. I mean, I think people are going to sort of learn, those protocols. I mean, there's been a number of folks who who've run for office, and suddenly there's something on Facebook that they shouldn't have posted there. But I think people are obviously learning. I mean, you're seeing an entire process taking place. I see it with my kids, where they're being taught and learning, and there's a whole cultural process going on. I do want to come back to, because I do think that there is a tension right now between how social media and technology is impacting democracy and sort of structural issues in democracy, right? There's so many structural issues right now that are effectively designed to push people not to find compromise and not to get to the center from both sides, and that are effectively forcing people to go to the opposite ends of the field. And I think, and I don't know what the answer is going to be in terms of whether social media and technology can help alleviate or address that. Aspirationally, I certainly hope that is the situation for the the benefit of small d democracy. But I think that's going to play itself out in a really interesting way, because I think if you look at Citizens United has created structural issues, the types of districts that people are coming from create structural issues. You saw the speech last night from the Senate candidate who beat Dick Lugar in Indiana, who basically effectively said, I have absolutely no interest in reaching the middle ground or compromising. This is a war and there's only one winner. Right?
By the way, did you happen to see Lugar's letter?
I did see Lugar's letter, right? But I mean, that's the type of politics that are taking place in the state here, and they're taking place in DC, and they're taking place, all over the country. And so can social media and technology ultimately, because my belief is that the vast majority of the public actually is a lot closer in some form or fashion to the 50-yard line than our political process reflects. And can social media be used as a tool and a vehicle to help actually cultivate that and provide an incentive for people to get back to the center, or get back to reaching compromise, get back to sort of understand that there's an election ends, and then we actually have to deal with big issues.
Do you both feel that way? I mean, do you feel that the public as a whole is actually less extreme than the representatives that are getting elected?
Absolutely. And I think that, what Chris mentioned is exactly right. You look and you watch cable television and you see two people that I can't determine what their relevance are to the political process, yelling back and forth, trying to be more bombastic and characterizing the other's views. And when I see views that are taking place on my newsfeed or online, or emails that I'm getting from my friends, in particular when I'm getting news on my newsfeed and Facebook, and I can see people that I may not agree with on a political issue, or maybe I didn't know that they had that view on a political issue, it puts a human touch, and I know that guy's a good guy. I know her. She's a friend of mine, or a coworker. And the reason they're weighing in on that issue so strongly is because they have strong views about it, and it makes me think a little bit differently about that issue. Opens up my ears to maybe considering things that I hadn't before. And that dialogue is lost in a lot of what we're seeing right now. And I think as online communications and social media grows, I think it's a positive force.
So that's another Back to the Future, it seems to me, observation, because when people gathered around post offices, which is where they gathered around in the 1840s and the 1850s, waiting for either mail or for the newspaper, I mean, they talked, and they came to, with the single exception of 1860, I mean, we've had transits of power every 4 years in this country, or 8, depending whether somebody was a two-term president, without violence. And there are very few countries in the whole history of the world that can say that over a quarter of a millennium period. So with all the faults that our system has, it's worked that well. I think the question is, is this going to make it better? Is it going to make things more of the same? I mean, Lugar's letter, which I only just saw just before coming over here, was quite interesting. I mean, this is the senator from, I think it was a 5-term senator, is my recollection, from Indiana, which is sort of a land of steady habits as far as I'm concerned. And the idea that he'd lose a primary, 5 or 4 or 5 years ago, this would have been, I think, unthinkable. And yet it happened. And it happened because he lost it to an uncompromising opponent. And uncompromising people are easy to admire because they don't compromise. But when you get to Washington, if you don't compromise, you have stasis. We have proof of that. So we're sort of in a catch-22, and what in heaven's name is going to get us out of that, I guess, and what role does technology have in getting us out of that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think Tucker's trenchant comments were right on. I mean, aspirationally, I certainly hope that it serves as a way to actually elevate the level of discourse, make it more civil, ultimately have people actually finding common ground. But I honestly don't know how it is all going to play out. I think that is going to be one of the really interesting dynamics. I do think, as you touched on, right, you have communities where people know each other and are having conversations with each other. On the other hand, you read any article that's at all provocative or touching on any public policy issue in any mainstream publication, and you go online, and these sort of vitriol of the comments with people attacking each other on these. I mean, it's fascinating and in some ways, reflective of democracy with people out there engaging and having, but the language tends to be pretty tough and pretty strident. So, I don't know. I hope it does.
But I mean, I think you have to pay attention to what's in people's ears and what's in their eyes all day long, right? I mean, if you spend an enormous amount of time on Facebook and in conversations with your friends and your family and your coworkers about the issues of the day, you probably are hearing a generally back and forth and you're having a civil conversation, right? You turn on cable news and they are putting a spotlight on the most obnoxious, the rudest, the person who's able to scream the loudest, right? And then they put a spotlight on the next screen over, which is the person who can like scream the loudest on the other side. And when that is the sort of 24/7 thing that's happening on cable, I think it brings out emotions in everyone else, and I think it makes people think that politics is like that. And I think politics then follows and is like that a little bit, which is,
Nature imitates art to some degree, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you have a media that rewards poor behavior and screaming and partisanship, and decides to put a live television camera on events that they know will outrage people and bring about fights, like the minister of a church population of 9 people in Arkansas or whatever, who's going to burn the Koran. When you decide you're going to put live TV cameras on something like that will drive a wedge, I think that's sort of where we end up when it becomes put a spotlight on that versus put a spotlight on the fact that people are having a very civil conversation in most parts of the country.
I guess what I'd come back to is that I think at the end of the day, this country, as you touched on, has generally gotten this stuff right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes we go through periods where we're feeling our way through. I do have great confidence that, historically, sometimes we may make a mistake or two, but generally this country is exceptionally good at getting it right. And my sense is that we're sort of going through one of those periods where we're sort of feeling our way through this process, but ultimately, I think you're going to sort of establish sort of a set of protocols and sort of cultural understandings, and in the future, people won't sort of either cover those events or they will just discount them and not respond in the way. I think as people become more sort of attuned to how it works, and hopefully as you get more and more people, as you get the broad segments of the population really actually living their daily lives in online and engaging, that actually will then serve sort of that leveling process and actually work as a way to bring people together. I do think we've gotten it right over the long haul.
We're running out of time. Let me just ask the three of you an impossible question to wind things up with. Let's say that, let's say for a moment that I'm Mitt Romney, and I call you up, Tucker, and I say, I need some advice. I want to win this election. What would you tell me to do to win?
That's interesting.
Yes, Tucker, what?
I would tell Governor Romney that he should probably check my track record and call someone else. I actually think that some of the things that we talked about are things that the Romney campaign will internalize, and that they hopefully will avoid the temptation to drive people apart and wedge different constituencies, and address the problem that we're talking about, which is how toxic the environment has become in politics. And say what you will about Governor Romney, he is an outsider to Washington, and I do believe that he's been able to be effective in a very blue state, and he is a person that understands compromise. And I know that's unpopular to say, but I hope that when all of the cameras are on him, that he will go back to considering that being able to agree on certain things and agree to disagree on other things, but wage a course forward that delivers real results, is something that the electorate is looking for right now. And that sells just as well in Ohio, in Florida, in Virginia, in North Carolina, as it did in Massachusetts. And I'm confident he will, and I think that Governor Romney has a very good chance of being the next president of the United States.
Sarah, you've just heard Tucker say that Governor Romney has a very good chance of being the next president, and I assume you're talking about 2012, not 2016. So I'm Barack Obama. I phone you. I've just heard this because the president watches C-SPAN, and we're going to be on it.
We're live. Okay.
I need your advice on how I should run this campaign so I'm going to be reelected. What would you tell me to do?
I would say that the way that you acted today is a perfect reflection of the president that people love, and that I think one of the things that the president that people love about the president is how authentic he is, and he showed that today. And I think that people appreciate that, and voters appreciate that. And I think one of the reasons I have so much confidence in him is because of his record, which I think that he'll run on. But I also think he's an excellent campaigner, and no one is better in a one-on-one fight than he is, and that he approaches campaigns that campaigns are important, and they're decisions about the future, and you don't go down in a campaign for not saying what you think, or not saying what you feel, or not saying what you think is the right way forward with the country. And so I think he'll go in guns blazing, and I think he'll be the campaigner that we've seen for years, and I think he'll be the authentic president that we have seen for the last 4 years, and I think that he'll be quite successful and do just fine.
What do you make of the two comments that you've just heard?
I would say this, as a Democrat, Tucker is very self-effacing. He is one of the best in the business, and I know we, on my side, were all very excited when he moved into the private sector, and we certainly hope over the course of this campaign, he stays in the private sector.
Right.
And as someone who wants to see the president get reelected, I hope that Sarah can take a little bit of a vacation from the private sector and maybe move back over to the campaign for the remainder. Look, I thought both comments were right on. I think the commonality that you heard in both was exactly right? Campaigns, particularly in this day and age that we live in, come down to trust. Who's the authentic candidate? Who do you trust? Who do you trust to make decisions about you and your family? And I think that it's going to be a competitive election. I think the candidate that does the best job of that is going to be in the strongest possible position. And Sarah, you hit it right out of the park. I think anyone who's on my side of the aisle who fundamentally believes the country is going to be a lot better place for the next 4 years if Barack Obama is reelected has got to be absolutely thrilled for the historic steps that he took today, what it means for a country, what it also means for his reelection.
I have absolute confidence in John Holler, and
please join me in thanking the panel. I think one of my favorite quotes about the museum was given to me by a member a couple of years ago who said, "This is the Switzerland of Silicon Valley." So I hope we've had a very Swiss but very provocative and wonderful panel tonight. So thank you to all of you for being here. Richard, thanks for leading it. Have a good night, everyone.